Ah, Hi, I'm Isaiah. And is being gay a lifestyle choice? Do queer people have more rights than the straights? Was the moon landing secretly an elaborate hoax orchestrated by the big gay in order to install a secret headquarters on the moon where Lady Gaga, Lil Nas, and other world leaders could shoot gay lasers at the earth, eventually hitting the US Constitution? Everyone's blood will be turned into rainbows, nobody will be able to drive, and Rolf! Despite the very strong Christian influence in my family, my parents had a very laissez-faire kind of way of dealing with these kinds of topics. At best, they were apathetic. I was never taught to hate or be disgusted by the gays, much less even find them weird. But I'd often hear less than tasteful takes, like how being gay is unnatural, or how my aunt thinks, so they should be able to do whatever they want, I just don't want them to force their lifestyle onto me. And while I could spend this entire video going into why these beliefs are dumb and stupid, and you should feel bad for being dumb and stupid, in all honesty, I wouldn't really be contributing much to the conversation. The open homophobia of earlier years is seeing a slightly downward trend in the general population. Sure, you may have that one homophobic or ignorant aunt who thinks that gay people have more rights than straight people. Or if you're in a relationship, you have that occasional conversation that eventually leads to the person asking, but which one of you's the man in the relationship? But plenty of other talking heads and LGBTQ plus activists have refuted these points to the moon and back. It's been much easier for queer people, me included, to find safe spaces and even be open about who we are or what we are in the general public. Yes, there is still a fair amount of homophobia and it is deeply unpleasant, but for the most part it comes from a very loud minority. What I'm trying to say is there aren't many questions that haven't been adequately answered by people who are much more qualified and much smarter than me. And that's why opinions? Ew, gross. I'm going to try to make this video an informative, comprehensive guide on the history of gays and lesbians. But in order to do that, slurs, conversion therapy, identity, all going to be talked about today. So get your pictures of Harvey Milk and your pride flags ready as we answer the question, why are you gay? What does it mean to be gay? If someone comes out as gay, does it change who they are? Most rational people would say no. Sure, they're more open about it and that can seem like they changed, but at the end of the day, they're still the same person, just no longer hidden under the surface. But when it comes to the relationship between someone's identity and their sexuality, the history behind that can be a little bit complicated. In order to properly talk about this topic, we're going to have to look at the quite frankly complex and complicated history behind the concept of homosexuality. How's that for alliteration? The idea that homosexuality is a part of someone's identity is actually fairly recent. For hundreds of years, you weren't gay, you just did gay things. This understanding of sexuality caused many LGBTQ plus people to feel alienated from society. There wasn't ye old Tinder or cuffed pants back then. You either risked quite literally getting burned or being stuck with someone you just kind of tolerated. Although understanding of the gay psyche is much more academic and beneficial to gays and lesbians in today's world, the previous mentality of separating sexuality from identity prevailed for many years. But as attitudes shifted, acknowledging that gay people existed was inevitable. And that's where the story really began to gain momentum. Queer communities had always existed, but it wasn't until the mid to late 60s that they really began to be more vocal and present. Up until that point, queer people and the community as a whole mostly stayed out of the public eye. Often outcasts of society, they would either join or form niche communities, either underground or away from everything else. That's part of why gay pirates is such a popular trope. Also, hello, Edward. Bloody windy out today. Gay people have always been around. There's many implications. We know gay people existed when the Bible was written because it was outlawed. Sappho of Greece made many implications, and Achilles, he was pretty close with his pals. After the revelation that there was a difference between straight people and queer people, this new way of putting people in boxes changed a lot, especially the way history is taught and recorded. Probably the most consequential period for gay rights in United States history, and yes, I'm going to mostly focus on the United States because...
And hark! What doth my eyes behold upon yonder shore? White people!
Catalyzed by the Stonewall riots, which... Christ on a bike! Catalyzed by the Stonewall riots, which, yeah, okay, fine, maybe they were sort of riots, the gay liberation movement began to gain steam. But there's an issue with the way American history is taught, and that's because people are unintentionally fed the narrative that it's a story of constant upward progression. But that's simply not true, and this isn't just isolated to the LGBTQ plus community. Prevalent throughout its history, the United States seems to have a tendency of taking one step forward and 2 steps back. Despite the fact that the Stonewall riots happened in the late 60s to early 70s, it took nearly 40 years for just having a same-sex relationship to be legalized, and another decade before same-sex marriage was legalized. It's a dark and terrible history littered with many terrible people doing many terrible things, like how gay men were terrorized by police in the 60s, or how the F slur also means a bundle of sticks, and gay people were called that because during the Salem witch trials, when women were burned at the stake, people found guilty of homosexuality were tossed onto the fire too, much like, you know. And we can't talk about the gay liberation movement without mentioning the blatant and horrible transphobia that was rampant throughout the entire community, which I feel was one of the main factors that caused it to die out. It's hard to push for inclusivity when you're not that inclusive yourself. Another main factor that prevented the movement from going very far was the AIDS epidemic. Ignorance, fear, and quite frankly the horrible handling the US government had over the whole situation caused thousands of people to die of preventable deaths. And even for those who were lucky enough to survive, their lives were ruined. Being told that you tested positive was basically a death sentence. And many gay men were scared to even talk about it because they could be fired on the spot. But if you want to learn more, a friend and I made a podcast for my history class. The link is in the description. You should give it a listen. Anyways, circling back, the assertion that being gay was a part of someone's identity, rather than just the actions of a perverted psyche, was unsurprisingly weaponized against the queer community. Now, being gay was something that could be diagnosed, an unnatural mental illness that needed to be treated, but could also be cured. Okay, so quick pivot. Of course we can't talk about the treatment of queer people without mentioning that yes, Rome was incredibly gay, and there were and still are a variety of non-Western cultures that don't view homosexuality as an abomination. However, the most dominant and widespread cultures and beliefs, such as Abrahamic religions like Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, and even non-Abrahamic religions like Buddhism, all have consistently and historically taught against homosexuality. But because of how much influence religion has on society, it wasn't until the mid to late 70s that the American Psychiatric Association finally acknowledged that being gay wasn't an illness that needed to be cured. Thanks to that cultural shift, more people nowadays have a born-this-way kind of understanding of homosexuality, and the idea that it's a voluntary choice made by a sinner has become less than popular. But some people still believe that to some degree being gay is a choice. Or at least the objective has shifted. At a recent Pride event, I had the great displeasure of talking to a born-again Christian. We threw condoms at him. And it was really interesting because he said that you can't control how you feel about someone. Something, something Satan, something, something hell. He also said that the world was being run by the Jews. Anyways, he went on to say that it's not the thoughts or feelings that are bad, it's what you do. It's the actions that you take, the choices that you make because of those feelings. Which to me is honestly a bit and hugely unfair. Basically, for the types of people who only feel same-sex attraction, that's an entire path to fulfillment that's just not available to them. In his worldview, gay people just don't have that option of being happy in that way. And the guy was married. Imagine growing up and being told that you can't have that because your version of love is different, that it's wrong or sinful. And that's essentially what conversion therapy does. It effectively tells young people that they can only ever have a lower quality version of romance, devoid of any legitimate romantic or your sexual feelings. Whether or not you actually like that person, well, if it's probably, then that's good enough to get married anyways. And that's just how it works fundamentally. The actual practices and history behind conversion therapy are a lot more graphic. Quick content warning before I begin. Before the APA made that decision in the 70s, homosexuality was still considered a medical issue. And it still is today, but nowadays, the general medical community doesn't come up with reasons to explain that phenomenon. To legitimately answer the question of why people were gay. Well, step into my medical office, said the doctor to the gay man. For example, Austrian endocrinologist Eugene Steinach believes that same-sex attraction between males was caused by a mutation in the testicles. So, of course, he conducted experiments by castrating gay men and transplanting heterosexual parts onto them. There were methods that were also quite graphic that are still used today. But this is the 21st century. We're much more civilized now. Instead of conversion therapy, we have something known as reparative therapy because, you know, if you're gay, you're probably broken. One trap that people who support conversion therapy often fall into is the idea that they're not forcing anyone to do anything. They're simply helping those who don't want to be gay. This was echoed by one of conversion therapy's loudest advocates, Joseph Nicolosi, who claimed, "We're not imposing, we're not forcing people to change. Instead, he simply wanted to find out what kind of experiences might have happened in your childhood that's turning you away from women." The idea that homosexuality is caused by trauma or purely by social conditioning is quite a troubling one. I remember when I first came out to one of my Christian friends, and the first question he asked me was if I had been molested. Despite how insensitive that question was, he was genuinely concerned that there was a reason behind why I'm the way that I am, or why other gay people are the way that they are. This belief is at the root of conversion therapy. But the idea that homosexuality is caused by trauma or forced social conditioning just isn't supported by any empirical science. According to studies and most experts, same-sex attraction is caused by a mix of hormonal, social, and environmental factors. But ultimately, it doesn't matter what the cause of same-sex attraction is. Although conversion therapy is becoming increasingly uncommon in many states, and a fair amount of legislation restricting it has been passed, it's still very much a problem. An estimated 20,000 LGBTQ plus youths are going to be subjected to such treatments, which, of course, are much more modernized and not at all traumatizing or nearly as violating, but still extremely problematic. And probably traumatizing. And until people stop believing the false narrative that someone's sexuality can be changed, it's only going to continue and very easily get much worse. Quite possibly the most famous and common path through which this practice is carried out is through organized religions, where in many communities, homosexuality is still seen as something immoral, as something sinful. I recently went to a fundraiser for my state's Attorney General, where in a very long-winded speech he talked about a case he took on concerning a florist by the name of Arlene. Arlene refused to sell flowers to a gay couple for their wedding. The local Supreme Court ruled that she was not allowed to do that because it fell under discriminatory business practices. So she appealed to have it sent to the Supreme Court. However, the Supreme Court refused to make a ruling on it, so the local state court's ruling was upheld. Ugh, I hate laws. Anyways, the outcome of that case came in stark contrast to a similar one that was heard by the Supreme Court concerning a wedding cake. If you haven't heard of Masterpiece Cake Shop versus the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, it's basically the same as Arlene's case, except instead of flowers, a baker by the name of Jack Phillips refused to sell a wedding cake to a gay couple. The Supreme Court ruled in his favor. I don't want to bore you with legal stuff, but basically there are things called protected classes or groups, and while businesses are allowed to refuse service to anyone, they cannot do that on the basis of that person being one of those protected classes. However, someone's political views are not listed as a protected class. Anyways, the problem here is that religion and politics intersect very strongly, and that's when things get complicated. Phillips claimed that being forced to sell a cake to a gay couple would infringe on his religious rights, and the Supreme Court upheld that. On the extreme end, the broader implications of that ruling basically mean that any business can just put a sign up outside that says "No gays served here." And if that doesn't remind you of something equally problematic, then, well, do you see why I hate the legal system? Now, this is a very complex and complicated issue that I condensed down to a couple paragraphs. So I strongly encourage everyone watching this to look into the specifics and learn more about these types of legal issues. Because legal things like this have very noticeable effects on the day-to-day lives of everyday people. But the main reason I brought this up is because these cases show that gay rights are a very unstable thing. Pop quiz! Do you remember earlier when I said it took until 2015 for same-sex marriage to be legalized? That's only because of a Supreme Court ruling, meaning the only thing stopping states like Texas, Alabama, Tennessee, and many others from making gay marriage illegal is a single legal document that can be overturned by 5 people, none of whom you voted for. Having sex with another man was illegal in many states because of sodomy laws until 2003 in Texas versus Lawrence, but that isn't codified into any law aside from that Supreme Court case ruling, meaning that that can also be overturned. Lesbians, though, they'll be fine. Cops will probably just assume that you're friends or something. Unless one of you is wearing a... Yeah, you know what? Never mind. It's none of my business, and quite frankly, it should be no one's business, least of all the state. Anyways, while I was still writing the script for this video, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, a nearly half-century-old legal document. So the only thing protecting a woman's right to an abortion was gone. Just like that. And that's why this matters so much, because of how easily it would be for the rights of gay people, lesbians, bisexuals included, to have their rights just stripped away in the blink of an eye. And if you think, nah, that'll never happen, one of the Supreme Court justices responsible for overturning Roe v. Wade stated that in future cases we should reconsider all of this court's substantive due process, precedents including Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell. One case protecting the right to same-sex marriage. He went on to say, and when we reconsider them, then we have a duty to overrule these demonstrably erroneous decisions. So, not much left up to interpretation, huh there, Thomas? Anyways, if you want to read that document for yourself, there's a link to it in the description. It's 213 pages long, and I read the whole thing because I hate myself, apparently. And sure, you may get lucky and be in a blue state with a legal system that would protect you regardless, but many states won't. Even now, there are many state laws that have been passed that directly hurt LGBTQ+ people. And for those people, this will be the reality that they will have to live in. These are the things that they quite possibly will have to deal with. But even in the less broader national sense, for cis-het people, these kinds of things determine whether or not you feel slightly uncomfortable in a certain situation. But for queer people, it's quite literally life and death. Whether or not we get to openly be happy or forced to be content with being just roommates. At the beginning of this video, I lied to you. Sure, over the course of 40 years, open and overt homophobia has definitely gone down. But hate crimes against LGBTQ+ people is still the 3rd most common type. I'm lucky enough to live in a blue state where I can openly dress like this without getting hate crimed. But even here, for people who are more openly gay, still get harassed pretty badly. Regardless of what you believe, people are getting hurt. People are suffering. And the sad reality of it all is that until the LGBTQ+ community has more protections, it's going to stay that way, and very easily get much worse.
LGBTQ, we're coming after you. We're gonna start